日本史学習に最高にもってこいのサイトサムライアーカイブスポッドキャストへようこそ。美しい自然にあふれてる縄文時代から波乱万丈な幕末まで全時代を網羅して日本史の隅から隅まで一緒に語り合いましょう。では早速日本史の世界へ。
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Samurai Archives podcast. This is Chris, and today we have yet another Tales of the Samurai episode. And the reason why I tag episodes like this with that label is because these are basically individual narrative episodes rather than a group discussion or a table discussion, that kind of thing, or an interview. So any episodes that you find tagged with the Tales of the Samurai tag are basically narrative episodes. They involve a lot of research and a lot of time. And a lot of notes. And on that note, thanks to all the patrons on Patreon for making this podcast a reality. I'm in debt to all of you, and my currency is podcast episodes, engineered to payback. So if you want to help out, check out patreon.com/samuraiarchives and see how you can help and see what I can do for you. But anyway, today I have something for you that you should find interesting. I'll be looking at the evolutionary psychology of aggression and warfare. And at first glance, it probably doesn't strike you as all that related to Japanese history, but let me stop you right there. I will tie it into Japanese history as we go along, but as I'm sure I've said on this podcast before, warfare shapes history. I mean, when you talk about history, it's pretty much built on war and competition. And as humans, we find that fascinating, at least in the abstract. I mean, most people don't want to go off and fight a war, but they're interested in the stories. I think it's fair to say that that's why a lot of you are listening. So we're fascinated with people, strategies, tactics, maps, tales of the heroes and cowards, the whole package. So as people interested in history, we're interested in this one particular human endeavor. Basically, masses of armored men charging at each other with bladed weapons. So the real question that you might not have even thought to ask is, why? Where does warfare come from? Why don't we live in peace? And that's not even to get into the philosophical debate behind what peace actually is and if it's a realistic target anyway. But my point is, warfare drives history, yes. But what drives warfare? Why is warfare such an integral and large part of our human history? If you've never thought about the why, it's just this thing we do. So I thought it would be interesting and even useful from the standpoint of a historian to ask, and consequently answer, why? I mean, I believe, as I guess what passes for a 21st century Renaissance man, I mean, relatively speaking, considering the fact that I have to hold a job and, all the nonsense stuff that modern people have to do. But anyway, I believe that you need to break open the silos of knowledge, so to speak. Step back and look at history from both the big picture and from another discipline altogether, in this case, psychology. History is, of course, the sum total of leftover written documents, sometimes mixed with archaeological evidence, although maybe not quite as much as one would hope. Historians and archaeologists don't seem to talk that much. I mean, I don't know, that's what it seems like to me, but, one deals with documents, the other deals with other objects in the dirt, and the narratives sometimes differ, at least generally speaking, from my outside point of view. Anyway, point being, there's just not a lot of interdisciplinary work done in history. I mean, psychohistory was a thing for a while where psychoanalysts tried to analyze history through Freudian concepts, which, and I'm very biased here, comes across as complete, total nonsense. But, I'll kind of get into that later. And I don't want to step on any toes here. So for the record, my words are my own. I am not a historian. But how often do scholars write books based on a mishmash of war tales, biased contemporary correspondence, and analysis of marching orders and so on, and call it good, versus those who take a step back and really ask, knowing what we know about human nature, does this make sense? And if not, why not? And kind of look at it that way, big picture. It's not easy because obviously there's some subjective judgment calls involved, so no one's at fault here, but like I've said before, and will probably say again, I'm a fan of interdisciplinary work. I'm a very big picture-oriented person, and in my humble, totally subjective opinion, a wider knowledge base on hand for analysis is always better. The whole reason this topic came up in the first place is because I've been working on an episode on the Sengoku daimyo Mori Motonari, which, by the way, was requested by a patron on Patreon, so hey, membership has its privileges. But anyway, as I was doing the research, I wanted to set the stage by talking about the Sengoku period in general, and as I did this, I started to think about how during the Sengoku period specifically, but also civil wars in general, the best always seem to rise to the top. You get this sort of Darwinian action where the absolute strongest, smartest, most clever warriors end up in positions of power. It's a ruthless situation with such intense competition that if you're not the best at everything, you die. But there's something else about civil wars, and I think you also see this with the US Civil War. It's not always, or not only, the strongest that end up leading armies, but also the most interesting and unconventional. Now, I don't know why this is, but my guess would be that during a civil war in particular, you're probably relying less on established military structure, because of the societal breakdown, and more on an ad hoc military with lots of opportunity for the most capable to rise to the top, or a necessity for the most capable to rise to the top. I mean, look at Joshua Chamberlain in the US Civil War. Basically a 33-year-old scholar and language professor who was fluent in multiple languages, who ended up being a brigadier general fighting in multiple battles. So you get some interesting personalities. And obviously this is the case with Japan as well. I mean, even before the Sengoku period, you have larger-than-life figures from the Heian period, Taira no Kiyomori and the legendary Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and so on. Anyway, as I started really thinking about the big picture philosophical concepts, I started thinking about the psychology of warfare itself. And at this point, I realized that I had to expand beyond just a simple introduction to a podcast on Mori Motonari. So I actually set that aside for a moment and decided to dig into the evolutionary and behavioral psychology of warfare and violence. Basically, I went off down a rabbit hole, and this is what we got. This episode. And as I've mentioned in past episodes, my academic specialty, or I guess one of them at this point, my main specialty anyway, is psychology. So I want to spend an episode on the evolutionary psychology of warfare. I mean, like I said, I don't think anyone can deny that warfare is a part of being human. Now, that's not a justification for the industrialized slaughter of the 20th century or morally questionable modern dalliances, but like President of the UFC Dana White says, fighting is in our DNA. It's how we got where we are. And a lot of this is theory, but I think it's worth looking at for some psychological and behavioral context of the Sengoku period. First off, as with pretty much everything in evolution, and by extension evolutionary psychology, adaptations and behaviors develop in response to a pressure, or to solve problems. And as any male high school student can tell you, violence solves problems. Knock out the bully, problem solved. So the very short answer is violence solves evolutionary problems. With aggression in warfare, it exists for a reason, and the question, obviously, that evolutionary psychologists ask is, what problems does aggression in warfare actually solve? So I did some digging, and I found a lot of stuff. Mainly that aggression is set off in a variety of ways under a variety of circumstances. So it's basically a multifaceted problem-solving tool. Yeah, so violence is the Swiss Army knife of human evolution, and it's a nuanced Swiss Army knife. It's triggered under very specific circumstances. In other words, under certain conditions displaying certain features, violence is triggered as a strategic solution, but not under the same conditions displaying other features. So, continuing the tool analogy, it's not a hammer, just willy-nilly pounding things. It's very context-specific. For example, in the article Human Aggression in Evolutionary Psychological Perspective by Buss and Shackelford, and I kind of picked that paper specifically because it actually broke it down into specific hypotheses. So it was a convenient way to break this down. So anyway, they give 7 possible hypotheses in regards to how violence developed as a problem-solving tool. Not all of them are directly applicable for my purposes, so I'll only cover the most useful ones. I mean, there is a literal mountain of literature on competition for females in the evolution of violence among mammals, and most likely that's the origin of violence in our distant past. But I'm focusing on the last few 100,000 years where we were a little less animal-like and a little more people-like. So I'll skip that for now. So the first hypothesis is to take the resources of others. Basically, violence came or developed from gaining the benefits of taking resources from other groups or other people. Pretty obvious. Humans are pretty much the only animal that understands and prepares for future needs rather than just how they feel at the moment. Well, most of them anyway. But if a dog is hungry, it eats, and when a dog is full, it doesn't plan for what happens when it runs out of food. I mean, it might not even be aware from moment to moment that it will eventually get hungry again. So, I mean, as far as we know, it perpetually crosses that bridge when it comes to it. Whereas humans, on the other hand, well, we're well aware of the future and we plan for it. So we stockpile supplies for the future. And as we know, warfare is often, or almost always, in one way or another, about resources. Takeda Shingen fought a war with Uesugi Kenshin over sea access, and sea access means fish and salt, two resources that he needed in his landlocked province. And if you can successfully take someone else's resources, you survive to reproduce, and they don't, thus propagating the trade. And in the past, that often meant that women were also a resource, and I think we referred to these resources as loot and booty in a previous podcast. So again, that trait propagates. And in ancient human history, resources were everything. So warfare to protect bountiful fishing grounds or fertile areas with lots of fruit would have been common and necessary. Warfare was a huge part of life for ancient humans, and a lot of it was in the name of protecting resources. And, by the way, if you haven't done so already, take a listen to episodes number 114 and 115 of the Samurai Archives podcast. Those episodes look directly at Takeda Shingen's resource management in Kai province, and it's a fascinating episode without a sexy title, so I totally understand if you skipped it, but you really should check it out. Okay, so the next hypothesis is tied to this, and that's as a defense against attack. If you have resources that other groups want, you need to be able to defend it, or else you risk everything from loss of honor to loss of status to straight up death. So basically building up an arsenal, fortifying it behind a strong castle on a mountain to take advantage of the high ground, maybe toss in a moat, set out some guards with nasty spears, that sort of thing. So you can defend your loot and booty from the enemy, right? The third hypothesis is basically a cost-benefit development of aggression in warfare. Basically, if you're willing to risk violence to take resources from others and are successful, violence and warfare increase your status. They increase that loot and booty. You come out on top and your team has a lot of resources and kids while the other team doesn't. And the greater in cost in resources and life you inflict on your competitor, the more successful you'll be and the worse off they'll be. During the Sengoku period, land was a resource. A lot of daimyo had to attack neighboring provinces in order to grab up land to give to their vassals. A daimyo couldn't really maintain his status if he wasn't able to provide prizes for his generals, so he'd do a cost-benefit analysis. Should I risk attacking this or that neighbor for his land, or should I risk disgruntled generals? That sort of thing. Along these same lines, you have deterrence. A reputation for brutal violence means your rivals are less likely to try and attack you. And common sense says that if you know someone is liable to beat the hell out of you if you challenge them, you won't challenge them. And evolutionary benefits go to them. Going back to the high school analogy, and well, it's been quite a while since I was in high school, so maybe things have changed and everyone sings songs and bakes cookies together, but back in my day, after walking to school uphill in the snow, the only effective way to get people to leave you alone was to throw a nasty beating on the person messing with you. You show them and everyone else that you're not a target, and you keep your lunch money. So in the analogy, you keep your resources because people know that if they mess with you, they get hurt. From an evolutionary standpoint, this line of reasoning goes that violence developed as a way to signal that rivals need to back off, thus preserving your resources. Take Oda Nobunaga, for example. His reputation for brutality was well-earned, obviously. I mean, for example, when the monks of Mount Hiei assisted his enemies, he had the mountain burned from top to bottom, killing every man, woman, and child. Here's his thoughts on the situation.
I am not the destroyer of this monastery. The destroyer of the monastery is the monastery itself. As you know, I am one who has not known a moment of peace. I have risked my life. I have devoted myself to the hardships of warrior life in order that I might restrain the turbulence within the land, check the decline of imperial prestige and restore it, improve the prevailing manners and customs, and perpetuate the benefits of government and religion. But last year, my enemy seized the opportunity of my absence to invade this province at the head of several tens of thousands of warriors. Thus, I was compelled to return here and to fight them. The deep snows hindered their retreat, and they were about to be slain by our men, when the warrior monks of this monastery came to their assistance. I tried to reason with the monks, but they would not listen. And so I informed them that if they persisted in their decision, I would kill them all and burn their monastery to ash. Still, they would not yield. I do not speak falsehoods. It is they who obstruct the maintenance of law and order in the realm. Those who would help rebels are themselves traitors to the realm, and I will not let this stand. Not a single life will be spared.
So in this case, you could kind of argue that, oh, well, he was just a bloodthirsty villain, and that's why he killed everyone. But, if you look at it objectively, he was setting a precedent. He was making a statement. Get in my way, and I'll destroy you. At least until it didn't, and his general, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned on him and killed him, so there's that. And on the topic of deterrence, I'd say that revenge and retaliation also fall under this subheading, at least partially, since it's basically what comes after the initial violence. You really can't dispute that revenge looms large in the human psyche. I mean, the person taking revenge for damage done to themselves or their family is a basic human archetype. Revenge is an entire genre in and of itself in books, movies, and legends. We all understand revenge, even if we don't always agree with it. Based on what I've been reading, I'd say revenge is an evolutionary side effect of violence. After all, revenge historically came about after violence has already been done to you. I mean, that's basically how it works. So following the theory, someone who successfully takes revenge for a wrong done to them extracts a cost from their enemy, which has the added bonus of a deterrent effect for anyone else out there looking to take advantage of them. So it's a reactionary form of deterrence. Now, another hypothesis is that violence developed as a way to navigate social hierarchy. And during the Sengoku, this was the driving force behind warfare. Successfully doing violence on the enemy was a way to massively increase your status as a daimyo, general, or dirty-faced peasant foot soldier. There's a ton of stories of low-ranking samurai who were elevated due to their success in battle, including everyone's favorite son of mud-caked, millet-grubbing dirt farmers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. I mean, there's also the tale of a samurai who fought so bravely against Tokugawa Ieyasu that after the battle, Ieyasu hunted down the man's son and took him on as a vassal. There's a bunch of examples, and this has come up before in the podcast, but the whole idea of raising up your name, for lack of a better term, was a big deal in the Sengoku, because if you fought bravely, even if you died, your actions would reflect on your family and clan. If you ran away, it could have grave consequences on you and your family or clan. So samurai would fight to the death essentially to prevent shame and loss of status on their families. Not so much this Bushido thing, but more because of the repercussions of what would happen if they didn't fight. And on that note, if they survived, the payoff could be huge. If a general or daimyo notices you, it could change your entire life. So, that begs the question, why is honor and societal standing so important to us? Well, think about it. 20,000 years ago, you might live your entire life with only 40 people, and with Stone Age technology. You had to rely on your group for everything. Social standing was the most important thing you had. It was the currency of survival. It directly influenced how much food you got, how much power you had, who you mated with. It got you protection from predators or other hostile groups of humans. Everything came down to your standing in the group. So a loss of social standing was pretty much a lethal proposition. So violence in the name of preserving your status was a straight-up survival mechanism. The absolute worst thing that could happen to an ancient human would have been to be cast out of the group. It was a death sentence, so killing rivals or challengers to preserve your status would have been a given. I also want to go back for a second. I mentioned raising one's name as a motivator for samurai to fight to the death or at least perform admirably in battle. So here's a question. How does evolutionary psychology deal with heroics? Luckily, I found a paper specifically dedicated to this topic. I mean, it's an interesting question because heroic deeds in battle more often than not get you killed. For a point of reference, something like 60% of people who won the American Medal of Honor died in battle. So, suffice it to say, being a hero is inherently dangerous. But even still, heroics are always a part of warfare and are a large part of human fiction about warfare from Homer to Shakespeare to George R.R. Martin. And being a hero puts you in a strange place genetically because heroics in battle make it more likely that your group will win the battle, but it makes it less likely that you, the hero, will actually survive to reproduce. So you're kind of stuck in a catch-22. Heroics increase the odds that the group will survive, but decrease the odds that the hero will survive to pass on his quote-unquote heroic genetics, so to speak. So where does this come from? How could death-defying, or in a lot of cases, death-causing heroism have developed from an evolutionary standpoint, particularly if the odds the hero will actually survive are pretty low by definition? So there's basically two theories here. One theory is that this sort of altruistic behavior could have propagated in the gene pool if you sacrificed yourself for close genetic relatives. Theoretically, they would also have this potential in their genes, and so over hundreds of thousands of years of sacrifices, a hero gene would become more common. The idea here is that you yourself wouldn't necessarily need to survive as long as close genetic family members who also had this genetic tendency survived, and it would be passed on indirectly in that way. In other words, the idea is that if the person didn't act heroically and their family was all wiped out, none of those genes would have been passed on, and tens of thousands of years ago, small groups of humans were likely closely related. So this sort of sacrifice by an individual would allow people with very close genetics to survive. So in essence, these genes sort of survived by proxy. Another theory holds that altruistic behavior in general causes disadvantage to the altruistic individual, but causes benefits for the group, and in the big picture, altruistic behavior among members, while costing them some resources, benefits the group in warfare, and consequently benefits the altruistic individuals. So in other words, over the long term, altruistic behaviors of group members benefit the group and it allows them to survive. And so some of these altruistic heroes also survive, and in the long term, extreme altruism, heroism, and heroic sacrifice also develop as a trait that springs from the individual traits of altruism in general, and that helps the group to survive. All right, so what does this mean? Altruists sacrifice resources and sometimes their lives for the group, allowing the group to survive. The altruistic participation in warfare for the group might be the key to the group's survival. Either way, the jury's still out because it's hard to reconcile how something that would reduce the fitness of an individual, to put it into Darwinian terms, could propagate. How would something that reduces the odds of your survival and is costly to yourself as an individual be allowed to propagate in the gene pool? That's the question that evolutionary psychologists are still dealing with, so it's all theory. Now at this point, it might be worth pointing out here the obvious, and that is that violence isn't something that came about when humans transitioned from hunter-gatherers and small tribes into massive city-states. One paper I read pointed out that in a study of 31 modern hunter-gatherer societies, 90% had been involved in warfare with other tribes within the past 10 years, and 64% within the last 2 years. So basically the myth of the noble savage doesn't hold up. And if you're not in the know, the noble savage refers to the myth that primitive humans were innately good and uncorrupted by the evils of civilization, and that life was lollipops and rainbows full of peace, love, and harmony with Mother Earth. Nah, we all fight and kill shit. It's what we do. And violence solved problems that allowed us to progress from killing animals with spears and dying from a broken bone or an infected cut to listening to a podcast on an iPod in a time of peace and comfort unknown in human history. And if you're listening to this podcast, there's a pretty good chance that you eat better and have better health care than some of the most powerful kings and emperors in human history. So meditate on that. Go ahead, pause your iPod for a moment and just ponder. You have it better than some of the most powerful humans in human history. Okay, sufficiently pondered? All right. So I think at this point you're starting to see the pattern. If a person or group has aggressive or violent traits, and those traits help them survive, those traits get passed on. And human history is basically an endless story of conquest and violence, hyphenated with short blips of peace until something gets out of balance and starts all over again. Rome gets successful, fat, and lazy, inviting the barbarians to the gates, and the cycle starts all over again. And because violence and warfare developed as a problem-solving strategy, and a very effective one, in fact, we just can't seem to get rid of it. So I know we like to moralize about violence, and we wish we could wave our magic wands and make warfare go away, peace on earth, stay in bed, grow your hair, but it's in us. It's part of our genetic heritage. It sucks and it's crappy and all that, but that's exactly how we got here. So we carry this with us. So at an individual level, you might never raise a hand to anyone, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Humans are extremely adaptive and conform to a greater or lesser degree to the culture they're raised in, and pay a price for not following the social norms in regards to violence, whether it's a blood revenge culture or polite society. So you might pay a price for engaging in violence in one society, but pay a price for not engaging in violence in another. Generally speaking, the safer a society gets, the safer people need it to be. So on an individual level, if we grow up in safety, we want to keep it that way. But if we grow up in violence and chaos, we just sort of roll with that too. We adapt to the culture and surroundings we grow up in. This is why, for example, seppuku, and seppuku, by the way, if you aren't in the know, refers to the act of cutting your stomach open with a sharp implement, spilling your guts on the floor, making a big mess. This is why the Japanese of 200 or 300 or 400 years ago weren't as horrified and mortified by violent dismemberment the way we are. Like I mentioned in the seppuku episode last year, a lot of what we find traumatic or disturbing or taboo is culture-based. It's not specifically innate to being a human. But, big picture here for a second, my point is, humans are super adaptive. It's what our brains were meant to do. So if a person is born into a violent culture that is entrenched in warfare and reveres cutting your stomach, they'll be pretty cool with all that. But on the other hand, if that exact same body and brain grows up in, Vermont in 2019, let's say, it probably won't be. Society and culture can put in checks and balances to minimize violence. And so can subculture. So, for example, a professor throwing punches over a disagreement over a theory probably would have a cost to their reputation, whereas a hockey player getting into a fight on the ice might have the opposite effect. Society, culture, and subculture all add or subtract reputational benefits and costs to violence. In one case, you might take a massive reputational hit for engaging in violence, and in another case, you might take a massive reputational hit for not engaging in violence. There's a million examples of social pressures in both directions, everything from celebrating a war hero or someone proving their worth to a street gang by engaging in violence, to a, supermarket employee getting fired for attacking a customer, or being socially cast out for hitting someone in polite society. So I think it's fair to say that our brains, our biology, have a propensity for violence, but most, if not all, or at least the vast majority of the execution or reining in of violence is culture-based. Whether or not violence happens seems to be extremely sensitive to social context. I mean, is the natural human state to turn the other cheek, or is it the natural human state to get revenge? Do people turn the other cheek because it's what the Bible tells them to do, despite the urge for vengeance? Or is passivity the natural state? Like I said, a lot of this is culture-based. And we seem to have some sort of subconscious algorithm that we run every time we have the urge to be violent, which takes into account a calculation of how it will impact our social standing in the culture and all sorts of other moderating effects. I mean, there's a lot of philosophical questions here, but I'm not a philosopher. Well, at least not officially. And so I might have to get the rogue philosopher back on the podcast at some point to go over this. But I've seen it theorized, but I don't know if this has ever been studied specifically. But it'd be really interesting to examine the complex algorithms that govern violence in society. So, what does this mean? I guess it means two things, really, at least now that I think about it. The potential for violence and warfare is always with us. It's in our genes. We've basically inherited the psychological mechanisms that made our ancient ancestors successful. Mechanisms that are sensitive to contexts where violence might solve a problem. But we also adapt to our culture, and in a peaceful culture where generally needs are met and chaos doesn't reign supreme, there probably won't be much violence. The context that would normally allow for violence or call for violence wouldn't be there, so to speak. So there's sort of hope for us after all. I'm just spitballing here, but I'd theorize that it would probably take a planet full of countries with enough resources to go around, a law-abiding and peaceful internal culture without an overbearing government, and a perfect resource, technology, and ideological balance between all countries with none wanting to dominate physically, culturally, or economically, and no countries at an economic disadvantage or involving an ideology of domination. So let's just say it's pretty improbable. The odds are probably not that good.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
So basically, I think it's fair to say that most likely you'll have a huge percentage of the planet with civilian populations living in peace at home while conflicts go on abroad due to ideological differences and resource imbalance. Sort of like what we have now. Which, by the way, is a huge improvement over what life used to be even just 5, 6, 700 years ago, when something as simple as a boat landing on your shore could mean that the Vikings were there to kill everyone and take all your shit. And there's still places like that today, but if you're listening to this podcast, I'd wager you're probably not there, or at least I hope not. And if you are, get out. So warfare is probably going to stick around for a while. Humans are tribal. I mean, that's just the facts. We can live together pretty well in a shared society, culture, and language, but apparently have little qualms about taking things from the other. For tens of thousands of years or more, humans lived in little groups of 100 or less, and anytime one group ran into another group, it could mean bringing disease or violence. So it was advantageous to kill them, and as a bonus, nab their resources. And, this may or may not have been the common example, but this tribal instinct has lasted through all of history right up until today. Your tribe is in the right, the other tribe is wrong, and needs to be shouted down and attacked. Sound familiar? Well, there you go. Evolutionary psychology, everybody.
Yes, science!
But hey, on the bright side, individual choice also has a huge moderating effect on violence. I'd say most people not out on the lower outside edge of the bell curve of emotion regulation have the ability to override their emotions and make rational decisions. In other words, a person who always resorts to violence in a society that doesn't value violence probably has issues with executive brain function and impulsivity. There's something going on in their head that causes them to lack control. Violence as a problem-solving tool is triggered in them in every situation where it would have been historically or prehistorically, whereas a person without impulsivity issues can counteract that urge for violence. So, in addition to our biology and our society, we mostly have personal choice when it comes to violence, although obviously some of us more than others. So in a nutshell, basically we have societal norms that allow for violence in specific circumstances and others where violence isn't appropriate. That has a moderating effect on our behavior. On top of that, we have a big forebrain that allows us to either override our impulse for violence or override the societal programming. And then, like I said, you have people who just have shitty impulse control. But overall, our human tendency towards violence could be like our urge to eat sugar. It was adaptive and helped us survive in the ancient past and right up to a few hundred years ago, but nowadays it's just plain maladaptive. Suffice it to say, we're complex meat machines. And this is just humanity in general. There are actually differences in how males and females manifest violence and how they interact with social hierarchies. Quite a few differences, actually. I know, the idea that there are differences between men and women, mind-blowing. So let's start with the obvious. The majority of overt violence is perpetuated by men, and social hierarchies are primarily developed and policed by men. Basically, studies show that men in general are more likely to identify as members of a group and have stronger social ties than women. And because of this, men are more motivated to support their in-group against the out-group. Ever notice when a lot of guys talk about football or baseball teams, they say we? Like, hey bro, we almost made it to the Super Bowl, maybe next year. They're not on the team, but they identify with the team. And it follows that they hate the other team. I mean, if you're a fan of the Dolphins, you gotta hate the Bills. That's just good science. So this brings me to what's called the male warrior hypothesis, which basically states that men strongly identify with their tribal group and have a preference for group-based hierarchy to a much higher degree than women, and on average, and keep in mind that on average doesn't mean all men, have a tendency to distrust the out-group, have derogatory beliefs about them, a bias towards protecting one's own group at the expense of the out-group, and a lower threshold for engaging in aggression against an out-group. And so all this drives competition and violence between groups. And yeah, before you let your confirmation bias get all out of control and revel in the idea that men are evil because science, keep in mind that all of these tendencies were super useful and necessary for keeping us alive for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. We're the product of those who survived. Sure, we've got modern political systems, complex society, and crazy technology, but we're still built with the same caveman DNA. So this is where the tribal and clan affiliations come from. And studies show that men's identification with a group gets far, far stronger when the group comes into conflict with another group or adversity. Anyone who's ever taken an introductory psychology class would have learned about the 1954 Robbers Cave experiment. So basically, two groups of boys were formed up at random, and intergroup conflict was developed between these two groups by having them stay in separate areas, probably talk shit about each other. I mean, this experiment was before, ethics. And so each group became hostile to the other. Basically, just because they were put together in a group and given a name. I forget what they were called, the Snakes and Hawks or something like that. But just the act of being put in a group and told they were competing with the other group was enough to get them to hate the other group. But hey, on the bright side, later, some sort of fake adversity was developed that forced both the teams to come together in order to solve the problem, and they did. So the boys were loyal to their own groups when they were competing against each other, but then the two smaller groups came together into one larger group to solve the bigger problem that threatened them both. So generally speaking, based on these results, men need a superordinate goal. Give men a hierarchy and a defined place in it and a goal to achieve, and men are at their best. The Sengoku period is a perfect example of this sort of thing in practice. Over 100 years of warfare resulted in clan ties that were easily as strong as family ties, and in some cases stronger. And the Sengoku clans were very structured and hierarchical. And when in a state of conflict, men become both more willing to fight for their group, but also more willing to sacrifice for the group. Men actually get less selfish when their group is at stake. Another thing that history bears out during the Sengoku period. Remember the Bushido ideal? Well, there you go. And clan lines were fluid depending on the needs of the clan and outside adversity. Clans would join with other clans to fight off the bigger threat, and then sometimes after the threat was terminated, turn against each other. Shifting alliances to preserve the clan and willingness to sacrifice for the greater good of the clan. And when you think of these Sengoku clans, what purpose immediately comes to mind? Or what purpose did they serve? Protection and the ability to wage war. So I've talked a lot about individual aggression and sort of applied it to the large scale, but let's look at warfare specifically. The classic psychological view of warfare was that it was simply the result of cultural and social processes, that we didn't have warfare within us, per se, but it was the result of our environment or culture, or that it was a result of general intelligence. In fact, psychohistorian Lloyd Demas was one of the proponents of the violence is cultural idea. He believed that boys have a lower capacity to work through neglect and trauma, and this coupled with the cultural and historical tendency to treat boys more coldly than girls and to get less love and attention than girls resulted in violent behavior. Side note, he had some wacky theories about the brain that totally are not true. He was trying to use brain differences between boys and girls to kind of justify his theory, and it's been completely debunked at this point. He was basically grasping at straws, but anyway, basically, Demas says that this trauma is where violence comes from what he sees as, quote, abusive child rearing practices towards boys. And he did write this in the 70s where, I don't know, maybe this was truer than now, but this sort of psychodynamic stuff and attachment theory was all the rage at that point. So he was just kind of working within the psychological zeitgeist. Anyway, according to Demas, girls in the same situation suffer just as many problems as boys, but they tend to internalize their feelings while boys externalize and lash out. And thus, says Demas, this is where the world's violence comes from. I'm sort of oversimplifying, but that's the general idea. Now, I've been conducting therapy with clients for a little under 2 years, so I'm not an expert, but what he says makes sense on the surface. Men are more likely in general to externalize when depressed or stressed, and women are more likely to internalize it. But to claim that distant parents and being told that boys don't cry and all that is why we have war is just disingenuous. Although, to Demas's credit, what it does do is explain individual violence. Some people, and more men than women, who have been abused or had a tough life instinctively take their pain out on other people, while women tend to, eat chocolate and cut themselves with razors, I guess. I really get the impression that he was just building a theory based on what he saw around him that was more philosophical than empirical, and also, like I said, where psychology was in the 1970s. Coalitional violence is far more complex than individual violence. Too complex, in fact, to be ascribed to simply a side effect of how boys tend to be treated in human culture. Warfare is just not individual behavior expanded to a group-level behavior. That's just not how it works. The benefits you get from individual violence or aggression, from an evolutionary standpoint, are not the same benefits that you'd get from warfare. I've already gone over the individual benefits of violence and small-scale violence, and the male traits that involve hierarchies and the evolutionary benefits of aggression, but there is a big gap between the evolutionary development of individual behavioral adaptation and the evolution of group behaviors. War is dangerous, and so the question is, why would any being with the ability to understand cause and effect want to participate in something that could very likely get it maimed or killed? Why would a samurai with a family, some koku for income, and all the other rights and privileges that come along with the status want to throw it away on a war on behalf of some lord in a castle he's never met? I mean, that's a legit question, right? You'd think that the propensity for warfare would be bred out of humans because of the death toll that warfare puts on groups and individuals. Interestingly enough, it seems the answer is cooperation, or maybe more accurately, a side effect of cooperation. So why would cooperation have anything to do with the development of warfare? Well, what's the difference between a fight between two people and a battle of armies? Cooperation. Aggression between two people is just that, aggression with no cooperation. It's very basic. And if you win that fight, you get all the benefits associated with winning, and so those behaviors persist. But those individual behaviors don't generalize to group behavior. Warfare is not individual violence writ large. Basically, just being aggressive as an individual is unrelated to coalitional aggression. Here's an easy example to illustrate this idea. So there are plenty of mammal species where one single alpha male will monopolize an entire group of females against a massive group of other beta males because that one alpha male could dominate or kill any single one of the other beta males in the group. So the question is, why don't those beta males group up on the alpha male? Exactly, because individual aggression doesn't relate to coalitional aggression. I mean, even if only 2 or 3 beta males teamed up on the alpha male, they could beat him and monopolize the females themselves. But they don't. In fact, there are only really 3 species on the planet that form coalitional groups for cooperation in warfare. Humans, chimpanzees, and dolphins are the only 3 animals on the planet that form coalitions. So why is this? Based on the research, the reason for this is that these are the only 3 animals on the planet with the cognitive horsepower for it. Us, chimpanzees, and dolphins are the only social animals that have the cognitive sophistication to handle the complexities of this sort of social organization. And one interesting cognitive component of this is the ability to catch cheaters. To remember the people, or chimpanzees or dolphins, that didn't do their fair share of fighting or hunting or whatever, and punishing them by withholding the spoils. Catching cheaters and penalizing them over thousands of generations helps to concretize and strengthen the psychology of coalitional behavior. Selecting against cheating basically by default selects for cooperation. And cooperation means larger sustainable groups and more complex social systems and hierarchies. And as a social group that is good at catching cheaters, it also means that only the most cognitively sophisticated and advanced cheaters will get away with the cheating and being successful, which selects for that sort of cognitive complexity. So basically, the dumb apes that don't cooperate well don't reproduce, and cheating apes that get caught don't reproduce unless they learn to straighten up and contribute to the group, so they have to have the capacity to contribute. But also that the apes that work well in groups and the smartest cheaters reproduce. So there's a lot of high-level cognitive information processing going on in these coalitional groups, which you could theorize evolutionarily drives more cognitive power in the members over multiple generations, until you have hyper-complex social systems like an imperial system overarching a clan system tied together by inter-clan coalitions that fight and compete and cooperate with armies of guys in armor with paper flags on their backs and swords and spears. Also, aside from tracking social group members, there is some other cognitive math involved, mainly, what are my chances of not getting killed in this battle? During the Pleistocene, or about 2 million years ago to around, 11,500 years ago, the math was pure numbers. Who has the biggest group? That could be moderated a little bit by who had the bigger men and the better fighters, but for the most part, the bigger group would win, the group with the most numbers. And if you had a massive numerical advantage, you might as well have been invincible. And so loyalty to a group and the support of a group usually meant that you were going to survive. And so getting cast out of the group was basically a death sentence. But the main point being, if you had a big enough group, the odds of dying were randomly distributed across all the men in your group. So you might live, and if you did live, you'd get the spoils of victory, the loot and booty. So you'd be willing to fight because you might not die and could potentially get a very nice payoff after the battle. And from this psychology, you get things like mob mentality, which is really just our ancient caveman behavior transposed onto modern life. If you're a caveman in a group 50,000 years ago facing off against an enemy, you are subconsciously doing the will I survive math, but it also takes some disassociation to charge into battle even if you think that you won't die and your team will win. Your team is confident and charges forward into battle, and so do you. Part of this is also the fear of not participating, a fear of what could happen if you don't follow the group. So this reaction is what happens in the so-called mob mentality. You get caught up in the group behavior because 50,000 years ago, that's what your ancestors did as a group, and since they're your ancestors, they survived to propagate that trait all the way down to you. And you got that caveman DNA in you, and along with that comes a case of FOMO. If you were part of a small group, you were always in danger of being wiped out. So navigating these hierarchies was one way to survive. Building coalitions with larger groups, joining larger groups, that sort of thing would guarantee survival. So again, these social hierarchies that are built into our brains are there for a reason. Advancing in and maintaining hierarchies on an individual level guaranteed things like your next meal or your mating chances, and on a group level helped your group to survive. Now, all this cognitive math that I'm talking about, the one that does the calculation to see if your team will win, doesn't translate very effectively to modern technology and modern society, where you have things like a small group can wipe out a larger group if they have superior training and technology. But it's because of our human history that we're still attracted to tall leaders, or women are attracted to tall men, or men in positions of power, and we're instinctively more likely to be intimidated or back down when confronted by large people in general, and why bullies target smaller people, because we're animals, and like I said, we still have that caveman DNA. Our brains are basically doing cognitive math based on numbers that came from the Pleistocene. That automatic subconscious math can't really account for things like the size of a bank account, training in jiu-jitsu, or a concealed weapons permit, that sort of thing. We can consciously account for it, but it's not an automatic process like the ones that were implanted in us during the Pleistocene. Even things like laws. I mean, by all rights, a bigger person should be able to steal whatever they want from a smaller person who can't defend themselves, but the law swoops in and stops it or punishes the one that does the stealing. So, among other reasons, we have laws in place to kind of moderate our automatic behaviors. So basically, to sum up this idea, all of our instincts and subconscious ways of assessing people are a little out of whack for our modern society. It would be way more useful in a zombie apocalypse when technology breaks down and we run out of bullets. Then our instincts would be spot on. But in this postmodern technological society we live in, it's kind of out of whack. You know, we're flexible with our big brains, so it's not a total shit show. I mean, we do have that massive prefrontal cortex that allows us to moderate our behavior. But there's a lot of, which came first, chicken or egg types of components to all this, and a whole lot of moving parts, but hopefully you're starting to see the big picture. And I'm sure you can probably see why these traits survived at an individual and group level. The drive to protect the group from others, even to the detriment of your own personal well-being. Putting yourself at risk for the group didn't always get you killed, and if you were successful, it raised your status in the group. So this sort of behavior was selected for. Let me switch gears for a moment and illustrate this in another way. Let's put this into a theoretical context of a Seven Samurai type scenario. You have a poor Sengoku-era farming village way off out in the far corner of war-torn Japan somewhere. The village would need to be organized so they don't starve or get overrun by marauders or bandits. A social hierarchy makes for a much more efficient system than an ad hoc, willy-nilly organization. And since there is no actual protective infrastructure in place during the Sengoku, at least not in our theoretical corner of Japan, no society, no nothing, and you're faced with terrible adversity, you need to organize. It's organize or die out there. It's a Sengoku, man. So women are probably working the fields and having babies, so the men will have to do the group protecting and resource gathering. Not saying that women can't, but in pre-modern Japan during the Sengoku period where hostile armies or bandits could find their way to your doorstep, and you need someone to take care of the kids, the group probably would want to rely on the strong swing of a heavier man with a denser bone structure to fight off any would-be attackers. Just saying. So the hierarchy put in place helps to organize the group and to multitask. This group gathers food, that group gathers resources, this group guards the walls, and so on. And the male tendency to identify strongly with the group and to sacrifice to protect the group would probably come in handy during those times when the enemy makes an appearance. And the male competitive spirit would sure come in handy if a group of bandits came looking to take resources from your village. I mean, how long would a group last if their response to every challenge was, "Cool, take our food, we'll figure something out"? Not very long.
What am I doing when the zombies come? Right? Start reading up on shit. Get some powdered food. Plant some zucchini. Get a windmill. Right? And that's all well and good. But if you don't know how to fight, all you're doing is gathering supplies for the toughest guy in the block. Right?
So if you follow the point here, this is why these traits are still around. Because for probably most of human existence, the vast majority of our time was spent in the default state where resources were slim, predators were big, and other groups were dangerous. And so that's why you have dysfunctional behavior now, because the stuff that kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years is suddenly no longer all that necessary, but would come in real handy during the zombie apocalypse. So basically what helped us survive for 99.5% of our entire history on this planet is suddenly made counterproductive with modern society and modern technology. Now, I want to explicitly state here that I'm using gross generalizations. What I like to call grand sweeping generalizations. This doesn't explain individual human behavior. Sometimes it might, but not in every case. I mean, one of my psychology professors told me a long time ago that psychological theories and experiments tell you what the average person would do. Problem with that is there's no such thing as an average person. And he didn't mean that philosophically, he was actually being literal. So, for example, let's just say you have 3 people with reactions to a scenario that are represented as the numbers 2, 5, and 11. Okay, you've got 2, you've got 5, and 11, right? That represents these individuals' reactions. The average is 6. 6 isn't 2, it's not 5, and it's not 11. So the average doesn't really tell you about any one individual in the group. Thus, there's no such thing as an average person, if you follow the logic. So when people with no background in psychology joyfully point out generalizations about things like confirmation bias and conformity studies and groupthink and mob mentality, just remember that usually what that means in practice is that a large minority or somewhat of a majority of people show tendencies that lean in that direction. It doesn't mean that every single person on the planet suffers from these things. Just that on average, if you were to pull a random person out of a crowd, they probably would. That's really what it means. We're humans, and we have the benefit of a prefrontal cortex that allows us to override our animal instincts. It allows us to moderate our behavior. Well, some of us more than others. But point being, there are outliers in every single psychological study ever done. There's just been a tendency to sort of set that information to the side and focus on what the majority would do. Back to the Sengoku clans before I head off down another rabbit hole. So Sengoku clans were affiliations of up to dozens of main families with blood ties, but also ties of obligation. Clans were more than just blood. A lot of them weren't blood related at all, but were massive conglomerates that were part of the same tribe. The Takeda clan of Shingen's time was made up of Takeda family members, of course. You have Shingen's younger brothers, Nobukado and Nobushige, and his half-brother Ichijo Nobutatsu. But then you have other members who were hereditarily associated with the Takeda and others who were incorporated into the Takeda as vassals, like the Sanada clan or Yamamoto Kansuke. Throughout Japanese history, clan members married into the main clan or split off to form corollary clans. These were extremely complex social hierarchies, which required a lot of cognitive ability to navigate. And that's exactly what we as humans are built for. And it's also a good illustration of what I've been talking about. The members had strong associations with their clan and were willing to fight and die for the clan, and constantly came into conflict with other clans. It's textbook stuff. Even the way women moved between clans in political marriages squares with the primatological and ethnographic evidence that human societies have stronger kinship ties among men. For the most part, and in particular during the Sengoku period, the people who were crossing clan lines were women. I mean, they were basically passed around as pawns in a bigger political game, but you can infer a lot from this because the men weren't just going to give up their spot in the hierarchy to move to another clan. But for the most part, when they did move to another clan, it was a lot of the time a move up the hierarchy. Mori Motonari's sons Takakage and Motoharu made out really well being adopted out to eventually take over their respective new clans, and as a bonus, Motonari's 3 sons, Takamoto, Takakage, and Motoharu, all got to head up their own clans, with Takakage heading up the Mori clan. At least until he died. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. This avoided any sort of succession issues. Clan hierarchy preserved. So clans and tribes, basically hierarchies or dominance hierarchies, if you will, were extremely important in human history for a variety of reasons. These strict hierarchies helped to organize and protect individuals, helped to collect and protect resources, and really just helped humans to survive. And naturally, conflict resulted when different groups came together basically in what amounts to a hierarchical competition. Warfare, in a way, was just a strategy to figure out where each group fit into the larger hierarchy. And sort of like I said before, the way that we function within a hierarchy is probably a little bit dysfunctional now in the modern day. But again, that's what kept us alive and surviving for hundreds of thousands of years in the past. So in a way, I think philosophically, you could say that maybe we've kind of gotten ahead of ourselves developing a society and technology that is a little bit too advanced for our DNA at this point. Or I guess more accurately, maybe advanced isn't the right word. Just incongruent with our DNA. At least I'm pretty sure one could argue that. I think it can also be argued, or maybe has been argued, that our human intelligence derives from the cognitive demands of our complex social interactions. Like I mentioned, there are only 3 animals that develop cooperative coalitions to do violence on one another: humans, dolphins, and chimpanzees. Wolves, for example, cooperate, as do a lot of mammalian predators, but they don't conduct warfare, and they're run by the one alpha dog. Basically, the alpha dog is in charge until it could be defeated by another dog that would then become the alpha, but the beta dogs don't gang up on him. So you don't find coalitions of wolves competing with other coalitions of wolves, basically. I mean, it's just so natural and effortless for us that it might be hard to believe and impossible to notice, but the cognitive processing power needed to keep track of and evaluate the social dynamics in a complex human group in order to work together and navigate the social hierarchy is extreme. So I think the idea that this massive processing power was developed as our social complexity developed, and all of this processing power resulted in general intelligence as a side effect is pretty interesting. I mean, it makes sense. But as far as I know, the jury's still out. But to take a short dive into animal and human hierarchies, since this seems to have developed into a theme as I've been diving into evolutionary psychology, here's a clip of Dr. Jordan Peterson talking about animal hierarchies versus human hierarchies.
So I think you can derive a couple of things out of this, and this is where I think people are different than other animals, importantly different, is that, so you imagine that there's tremendous selection pressure towards the production, let's say, of men who are good at climbing male dominance hierarchies, or climbing the male dominance hierarchy. But the thing that's so interesting about people is that we've multiplied our dominance hierarchies. You know, if you take an animal that's got a rather static behavioral pattern, then there's a single hierarchy. Elephant seals are a good example of that. So elephant seals, the males are absolutely massive. They're way, way bigger than the females. And they basically have harems, roughly speaking. And they use physical prowess as their marker of status, essentially. And obviously size is a huge part of that, because otherwise the male elephant seals wouldn't be as... They're massive, these things. They're absolutely enormous. And so it's just power / health, you know, maybe aggression, something like that. It's whatever makes them more suitable for the kind of physical combat that elephant seals engage in. So, and the degree to which power is associated with dominance status in those sorts of situations seems to be associated with the size differential between males and females. So the more power is an issue with regards to male competence, the larger the males are compared to the females, and the more likely the males are going to have a harem relationship with the females. And you see that a little bit in human beings, because men are bigger than women. They're not overwhelmingly bigger, that's sexual dimorphism. And there's some men that are smaller than some women, but on average men are taller and they have more upper body strength and so forth. So there is a power element to male competition, but it's not as extended as it would be among animals, say like elephant seals. So in the elephant seal, you see maybe there's one stable set of traits that's being selected for that makes the males more likely to reproduce. But human beings, we're very weird creatures because we're so conceptually flexible. And so what seems to have happened, maybe males started selecting each other in dominance competitions for something like cognitive flexibility and conscientiousness. It's something like that. So that would be the ability to abstractly represent the world, and then the ability to operate effectively within it, to represent yourself socially in a way, and then to carry through with that, because that enables people to trust you. So it's something like that. And so that produced cortical expansion, and then women were selecting men who were good at that, and that produced cortical expansion. And then there's an arms race between women and men with regards to intelligence. So the women kept up, or they certainly kept up with intelligence as the evolutionary cycle continued. But one of the consequences of selection for cortical expansion and increased cognitive flexibility was that the number of dominance hierarchies that human beings could produce started to multiply, right? Because there's all sorts of ways that you can be successful. You think about how many ways you can be successful in a modern culture, and you can be successful in dimensions that aren't really even associated with each other. So you can be successful socially, that's what an extrovert would do. You could be successful in terms of intimate relationships, that's what an agreeable person would do. A disagreeable person would be more successful with regards to competition. A person who's high in neuroticism would be trying to protect themselves and to establish some sort of security. An open person would be looking for a flexible, creative environment. And so there's this multiplicity of ways that you can establish a dominance hierarchy and be successful in it. And if you're creative, you can come up with your own damn dominance hierarchy, which is exactly what you're doing if you're creative, right? You spin up a game that's your game, and then you make the rules. And that's hard, because if you make a new game with new rules, it's hard to monetize it. But you can be the best at playing that game, and so that's a huge advantage to being creative if you can pull it off. So then you think, well, what's happened among human beings is the multiplication of the set of possible dominance hierarchies, so it's become very broad. And then you could say, well, what's driving selection now is the ability to be successful across multiple sets of dominance hierarchies. And that accounts, at least in part, for our cognitive flexibility. And so that's really what a human being is. A human being is a creature that has high potential for succeeding across a very wide range of potential human dominance hierarchies. And so that gives us our transformative psyche. That's the niche that we've both produced and occupy.
And I guess to wrap up my final thought, violence was a tool that kept us alive. It's part of us. And there are two factors that moderate it: culture and our prefrontal cortex. Our brain, and by extension our psychology, is such that it molds to our culture. Whatever culture you grew up in feels perfectly normal and right, and other cultures feel strange and foreign. That's because our brains adapt so completely to our culture in childhood that it's as normal as, well, I can't think of a suitable metaphor. I don't know, fits like a glove or whatever. But our propensity for violence is dependent on how violence is accepted in our culture. Our brains have social stoppers, for lack of a better term, that stop us from violence. But these stoppers are culture specific. Some cultures have them, some don't, or they do in other places. Like I said, the example where a professor throws punches because he disagrees with another professor would not be seen as appropriate or acceptable, and so they're not likely to even get to that point in the first place. Whereas something like outlaw culture in the Wild West said that if someone challenges you in any capacity, you have to hurt them or kill them. So we have these automatic stoppers in place, but they're imperfect. Our prefrontal cortex allows us to bend or break the rules by choice, or our lack of impulse control just causes us to break them impulsively. So a combination of societal rules and the executive function of our prefrontal cortex determines if and when we conduct violence on an individual level. So that's some background in evolutionary psychology when it comes to violence. And I think it's good to remember that history is more complex than simply how cultures interact with each other and how the big man leads his people and so on. There are actually underlying processes in the human brain that kind of result in all of this stuff that we call culture and history. And it's easy to overlook because it's not something we're really consciously aware of, or at the very least, it's not something that we ever really think about. So history is driven by warfare, but warfare is driven by human psychology. It's easy to forget or not even be aware of, but all these guys are just people. Just regular old people. Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen. All these guys were just people driven by their psychology who were able to get to the top of their social hierarchies and drive change from there. So I find it interesting to look at history through a psychological lens because, like I said, there are underlying processes that drive everything that humans do. And at the most basic level, our existence and impact on the world derives directly from how our brains work. All right, look at that. I'm all out of notes. So we made it. I hope this sheds some light on where all this warfare comes from and why it happens, and hopefully I've given you a lot to consider. So feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Samurai Archives if you have any thoughts on this or think it's total nonsense, whatever. Feel free to give me a follow. But anyway, we'll see you again next episode. And again, I just want to give a shout out to the patrons on Patreon. And if you aren't on Patreon but are inclined to help out on the podcast, please check out patreon.com/Samurai Archives to see what you can do to help us out and for updates and bonus content. Also, if you're so inclined, please feel free to rate or review the podcast on iTunes. Okay, that's it for this episode. Catch you next time.